Hello, and welcome to Taming Your Mind, or How to Develop Your Thinking Ability, Chapter 10, The Tools in a Nutshell. Before I get started on the text, I want to let you know that this is a fairly short chapter, so I'm going to go through it and then talk about the tools for thinking and general semantics and science and sanity and how they all fit together. And hopefully you'll notice a slight uptick in the production quality of the show, less use of title cards overall. We shall see. So chapter 10 starts out with a little poem by Rudyard Kipling, who, if you haven't heard of him, you should. I keep 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I knew. Their names are what and why and when, and how and where and who. I don't know if those are supposed to correspond exactly to the 6 tools for thinking, but let's press on. We have now put 6 sharp tools in our mental toolbox. They are, and forgive the title card, so far as I know, up to a point, to me, the what index, the when index, and the where index. We must now learn how to make these tools as useful as possible in our everyday lives. The tools for thinking appear simple when described, but, like the golden rule, they have far-reaching consequences when we learn to apply them consistently in action. Let's go. Learning to use the tools for thinking requires at least as much effort as learning to use the tools in a carpenter's tool chest. The fact that you have seen saws and hammers as far back as you can remember, and even handled them a bit yourself, does not mean that you are able to use them in a workmanlike and effective manner. Only practice will develop skill. And remember, it is impossible for you to learn what you think you already know. And we have a couple of pictures of a mental toolbox. I'm not sure that's worth showing, even with the idea that you can put the freeze frame if you want to see them. I'll try to do better as we go along. And let me get a little drink. I do feel we should have something alternate to put on the screen, or a little animation or video there. Continuing at the top of page 144, look for the system. A system makes learning easy. You will find that the tools for thinking make up a neat little system. In a system, the parts are interrelated. Each implies other parts. You will find that sometimes several of the tools seem to overlap. In certain situations, two of the tools can be used to do approximately the same work in your thinking. When you begin to see how the tools for thinking are systematically connected and overlapping, then you will know that you are beginning to understand them. You will find that each one makes you think of other tools. If this were not so, it would be hard to translate them into action in your everyday thinking. Stray, unrelated bits of knowledge are likely to be forgotten soon. So begin to observe how one tool leads you to think of other tools, and notice how frequently some of the tools are interchangeable in their functions. Remember, these are tools. There is no one set way to use any of them. And remember, what you get out of them is not up to the tools. It is strictly up to you and your own cleverness in putting them to work. Every effort has been made to present these tools for thinking in a simple way. This has been designed as a handbook which can be read and absorbed as painlessly as possible. There is a danger that it has been made so simple it will be ignored by many people who like more scholarly presentations. The purpose of the tools for thinking is to enable everyone to achieve mature thinking habits. Without these tools for thinking and the philosophy of thinking in terms of verbal maps, it is much more difficult to learn the basic premises of straight thinking. And the next section is read this book several times. If you will read this book a second time, you will find that you get much more out of it than on the first reading. The first reading serves only to break the ice. On the second reading, it really sinks in. Even on further readings, you will find that you notice new things and develop new insights. You will find the outline on the next page useful in checking your knowledge of these tools. And that's it for Chapter 10. The next section is Part 3, Using the Tools in Everyday Life. And the book gets a lot more specific there. The 5 chapters coming up are getting along better with other people, build a happier marriage, achieve success in business, find causes for things that worry you, and 5, build a world free from wars and want. So there's quite a range of everyday life there, from getting along better with other people to build a world free from wars and want. And I do think that this section of the book, Part 3, is probably the one where the book shows its age. You do have to remember that this was originally written under the title How to Develop Your Thinking Ability in the 1950s, and it was republished as Taming Your Mind, I think in the mid-70s. But I will try to continue the reading of Taming Your Mind into this audiobook on YouTube and perhaps other platforms, I think the book as a whole, particularly if you understand the changes in society and how we look at men and women and their roles and how flexible we are about them, which has always been a point of contention. I think just learning something about Amelia Earhart would give a person some appreciation of what it must have been like in previous decades. And I'm not even sure when Amelia Earhart was doing her flying, but I'm pretty sure it was before 1950. I think it was more in the 1920s and 30s, maybe 40s. That would be a separate video, and I'm sure people have done videos on Amelia Earhart, and there are books, or Wikipedia for that matter. So, I'm not going to go back to the diagram or maybe I should, why truth is so hard to reach. And the things that are obstacles are everything changes, things appear differently to different people, things exist in varying degrees, things may act differently in new places, and no two things are identical. And we talked about all of those things in the earlier text. And you can never know all about anything is written on the wall. And the diagram of the 6 tools for thinking and how they relate, why it's difficult to make adequate verbal maps, tools that can help us, and how the tools help us, is actually a pretty interesting summary. Although I don't think reading it right now would really make sense. I really want to talk more about general semantics and Science and Sanity, which is Korzybski's book, and another topic which relates to general semantics, which is the structural differential. So Ken Keyes, who wrote How to Develop Your Thinking Ability and Taming Your Mind, was a student of Alfred Korzybski's. And he's among many students, I'm not saying tens, but I know of like between 5 and 10 books that were written by students of Korzybski's. And I wouldn't be surprised if the number was quite a bit higher. And of course, it would depend on whether you mean the whole book is just trying to look at general semantics from a different perspective, or that the book was influenced by general semantics, but it's really just one of several influences. The whole field of Gestalt therapy is kind of based on general semantics, but I wouldn't put every book about Gestalt therapy or neurolinguistic programming as direct student of Korzybski's results. The ones I'm thinking of that fit into that are Wendell Holmes' book, People in Quandaries, which was looking at general semantics from a psychological perspective. S.I. Hayakawa's book, I think the title is Language in Thought and Action. I'm sorry I don't have a copy to hold up at this point. And now I'm getting really fuzzy as to exact titles. Let's see if I can find this fairly quickly. Yes. Levels of Knowing and Existence Studies in General Semantics by Harry Weinberg. And that's a 910-page book that I have not read the whole thing. Actually, I don't think that's true. Wait a second. No, I'm sorry. It's a 304-page book that I haven't read completely. And it looks like a very readable, I don't want to say simplification, but a different person's perspective on general semantics. And I think Irving J. Lee also has written a book, although I've seen more videos that he's done than read any of his books. So, what more can I say to give you the idea before we get to the structural differential? This is going to get somewhat repetitive, but the main book is Science and Sanity. This is actually selections from Science and Sanity, and it's not too long, page count of like around 200. The full Science and Sanity is 910 pages or thereabouts, depending on the edition that you're looking at. And it's characterized as a difficult read by some people, even including Korzybski himself. And that's part of the reason he did selections from Science and Sanity. It's his selections. I want to find a note that he wrote, he being Alfred Korzybski. Wow. We're really approaching, or maybe have exceeded, the limit of how long I can break in order to find something. So I'll just say that Korzybski himself, here we go. Korzybski joked that the unabridged version of Science and Sanity around 800 pages long, needed its strong sewn cloth binding in order to survive, having exasperated readers pitch their copies from high-story windows. Since its 1933 publication, the book has gotten a nickname, The Blue Peril. And that's from Bruce Kodish's foreword to the second edition of Selections from Science and Sanity. I still think the full book is very worth reading, or at least taking a look at. It's easy to get a PDF of it, and depending on whether or not you're comfortable reading off a screen or if you need a book, the PDF might be fine. Here's a link to the edition of General Semantics that's at the European Society for General Semantics website. And I'm going to transition back because of the complaints about title cards staying on screen too long. And if you want to, of course, you can freeze the video there, or just search on Science and Sanity, Korzybski, maybe throw in European so it'll quickly get you there. That site has all the chapters as individual PDF files. There is also a PDF of the, I believe, 4th edition, but I'm not sure, on the Internet Archive. And the 5th edition, I'm really not sure what site it's on, but I know it's easy to find. And as one large PDF file, it's kind of hard to deal with and look for things. So the European Society for General Semantics is really a good place. It's the easiest place to read the full text. And I would suggest starting with chapter 1, just skipping all of the forewords and prefaces. Not that they're not worthwhile at some point, but I think Korzybski's actual words are the best place to start. Now, here's a picture of the structural differential so that you have some idea what I'm talking about. And I realize it may look kind of bizarre, and this is where General Semantics can easily get a reputation as kind of a cult, because I think, having to handle the structural differential as part of learning General Semantics, I'm going to transition back to me. If I start to explain the differential itself in terms of its parts, I'll bring that back on screen. Some of you may be wondering why I don't just put it on the screen with myself. And that's a very valid question. And the answer is, I tried just before this to make a scene in OBS with myself in the corner and the structural differential there, or even myself on one half of the screen with the structural differential on the other, since it is kind of a tall vertical object. And I was not able to. And I don't mean to disappoint people who believe that I know a lot about computers, and I think some people or even know that I have some background in video, but I could only get either the structural differential or an empty box in the corner of the screen. And I'm not sure why yet. I suspect a problem with this version of OBS. I've had to back install it because the latest version has other problems and I really couldn't get anything on the screen. So hopefully I'll get through that and we'll raise the production values. For now, bear with me. So putting aside concerns about the cult aspect, it's hard to actually get a hold of a structural differential, although I think it would be fairly easy to make. And if any of you watching are inclined to 3D print or laser cut or some other form of metal work or plastic work, a structural differential, I think that would be wonderful, fabulous, marvelous. It is patented, but it's a very, very expired patent, so you certainly have the right, and I certainly have the right, to make a structural differential. It's not necessary to follow Korzybski's and the other people who worked on it in metal really closely. And a diagram can also be used, and there are diagrams of it. But Korzybski felt that some of the learning could best be learned by handling the differential in terms of learning at, I don't want to say lowest, but all parts of the nervous system, including the parts that are in your hands and, transmit messages, and the various parts of the brain. And of course, that is a whole topic. It's kind of like how there's some belief among educators, and I would count myself among people who believe this to be the case, that learning to write and read gives you certain learned brain things that you can't get from just reading a screen. And, this is not a new concept. I just learned recently that I think Socrates, I'm not positive, but somebody who was around when writing was invented felt that people who learned from written text instead of learning it by oral handing down through generations wouldn't really know things because they didn't memorize them or learn to remember them. And I think that's what Korzybski is getting at with the structural differential. There's some parts of what General Semantics is trying to teach that it really helps to use the structural differential to teach it to your nervous system. Taming your mind, on the other hand, I'm holding the book like that'll help you understand. I think doesn't really depend on the structural differential. It's like the simplest, maybe, I don't want to put it down, but one level of general semantics that you can kind of put the whole thing into a small book, kind of like a handbook. That was the idea. So, what else can I tell you? I guess I'll give you a quick description of the parts of the structural differential. I don't have the U.S. patent drawings available to put on screen, but they're easy enough to get. Searching on U.S. patent structural differential, Korzybski should get it for you. So I'm going to go back to putting the differential on screen and talk about, boy, I really should have a tool to let me highlight things, but I'm just going to do it verbally. Sorry. So at the top, we have the parabola that's covering perhaps the top quarter or third of the screen, and it has one little rectangle stuck in front of it and a bunch of strings coming down. And it's hard to see on this screen, but the parabola is actually a three-dimensional object, kind of like a spaghetti strainer or a colander, with the top cut off and a jagged edge at the top. The jagged edge represents the fact that the universe goes on, as far as we know, indefinitely, or certainly larger than we can represent on the structural differential. And the parabola, in a sense, represents what in general semantics is called WIGO, or it's spelled W-I-G-O, and it stands for what is going on. And it means exactly that. What is actually going on? You know, atoms spinning, light moving, matter moving, and of course you have to keep in mind that matter is at its most basic form energy, but that's a whole different topic, of course. Going on with the structural differential, the two circles that are underneath the parabola represent the first level object. The object that we create or is created in our minds to represent what is going on. And you can see the strings from the parabola going to the object, and you also should note that there are many, many characteristics represented by the holes in WIGO that don't make it down to the parabola. We don't comprehend the full universe at any time, even for a simple object like a pencil, that we can't know all. And one of the important things that the structural differential teaches you is how ridiculous it is to think about allness or think that you can comprehend all. Although, in some ways, maybe you can, but that's a whole separate topic that Korzybski explicitly didn't cover in General Semantics or in Science and Sanity. He explicitly said that he's not covering spirituality, but that isn't because he doesn't believe it exists. It's just because it's not what he's focusing on about a non-Aristotelian system and general semantics. So let me keep going on the structural differential. I have a feeling I've left the picture up on screen too long. I'll try to, okay. The second disk that you see hanging off the kind of horizontal bar there, if you notice that, I'm going to go back to me now, and that represents an animal, such as a dog, and the animal object that general semantics is attempting to focus our minds away from. If I'm going to go back to the actual picture now. You can see that the rectangles underneath represent abstractions, and the animal object really should have a couple of abstractions. I'm not sure why in this particular picture it doesn't, but I think anybody who has lived with a dog or a cat would agree that they do some abstracting, but they don't really use language in exactly the same way we do. I'm going to go back to the picture now. Ooh, sorry. Confusion there on my part. The rectangles underneath the objects represent abstractions. And I think they may have been trying to make a point about language here, because normally there would be a few rectangles before you get to any language levels. But the point is that human beings abstract, use language, and that the abstractions eventually come full circle and interact with both the universe itself, as represented by the rectangles going back up in a loop on the right to the parabola. And they also interact with our object and our, I'm going to go back to me, and our perception of the object. And in the first chapters of General Semantics, or in any college level class in General Semantics, which there are still a few, it was taught at more colleges and universities in the 1950s than it is today. You would, in those courses, you would try some experiments and learn about the ways in which our conscious mind can influence our perception. And they're pretty amazing demonstrations. Some of them would be spoiled if I talk about them in advance, and some of them are not, such as looking at text on a wall that you can't read and somebody telling you what it says, followed by your being able to read it. that's, I think, an interesting point about how the nervous system works. Let's see, and other examples I really don't want to talk about so that they're not spoiled as examples. I think I've talked enough about general semantics. I'm not sure this is really worthwhile, but I'm going to go ahead and describe the table that puts the 6 tools for thinking on one page. It's on page 147, and I'm thinking as I look at this that it would be a really good thing to reproduce in some form, maybe updated, like not just copied out of the book, but updated both from a 2023 versus 1950 point of view, and also updated from the general availability of really nice typesetting equipment. Like at the time that Taming Your Mind and Science and Sanity were printed, typesetting was not in quite the easily available form it is now, although there's a case to be made for typesetting having gone backwards too. So without getting into that, I'm just going to read and describe the organization of this table. And I'm going to hold it up to the camera. I'm not sure that that's actually good enough, but maybe it is with a freeze frame. The 6 tools for thinking, and the column headings, I think I'm going to go through the rows. As I said earlier, are why it's difficult to make adequate verbal maps, tools that can help us, which are the 6 tools, and how the tools help us. So, no one knows all about anything, and a single overlooked fact may force us to revise our verbal maps. The tool that can help us is so far as I know. How the tools can help us. This tool reminds us of our incomplete knowledge and helps us keep an open mind toward new evidence. So it's just getting in the habit of thinking so far as I know until it becomes something that you don't have to think anymore. Don't forget that general semantics is more like yoga than anything else. Yoga for the mind. You have to practice it in order to apply it in your life. And when you can do so in the same sense that yoga improves your posture, and you don't have to think about your posture after you practice yoga, general semantics and the tools for thinking can improve your mental functioning, and eventually you don't have to think about them anymore, just as you don't have to think about driving a car when you're doing it. This is a fairly subtle point, but hopefully I've gotten across some of it. Going on down the column. Most things in this world are not pure black or pure white. They range from all to none, from 0 to 100%. Our either-or habits of thinking often mislead us. And the tool to help us with that is up to a point. This tool reminds us of the degree nature of things. It makes us survey the territory to find out up to what point things have the characteristic we are interested in. On the next row, the way we feel about things depends on our own particular heredity, training, experiences, and personal interests. And I would add to the text, etc. at that point. Each of us has his own particular brand of mental one-sidedness. And the tool is to me, and to me reminds us that no one sees things from all points of view. To me warns us that when we make judgments, we are talking about our own tastes and standards just as much as we are talking about things outside of us. Next row. Why it's difficult? No two things in this world are identical in all respects. We frequently make mistakes in assuming that all things called by the same name will act the same. And this is the first tool that's an index. So the first three tools are not explicitly indexes or indices, and the last three in the 6 total are indexes. The what index. Man 1 is not man 2, or human 1 is not human 2 would be an update to bring it up to current standards. Thing 1 is not thing 2. And how the tool or index helps us is index numbers remind us that we can be misled by group words and averages. They help us watch for differences that make a difference, which is a kind of key aspect of general semantics. Differences that make a difference. Next, we live in a process world in which all things are changing, and there's a legitimate use of all. The facts of yesterday may be the fictions of today. And the tool for that is the when index. Henry Jones, 1964, is not Henry Jones now. The when index reminds us that this was the way things were when the territory was surveyed, and that the march of time may have made our verbal maps out of date. And the next and last row is any particular person or thing may act differently when put in new circumstances. Nothing exists in isolation. Everything is affected by surrounding conditions. And we have the where index to help us. Shark 1 in water is not shark 1 on land. The where index will remind us to be on the lookout for changes in behavior when man 1 or thing 1 is placed in a different environment. I'm trying to think about a summary of where we are or what to do at this point. I certainly would like to see any individual's table of the tools for thinking. And I think that would be fairly easy to do in a word processor, to put the 6 tools for thinking and what they help us with and how they help us onto a single sheet, the same way either Ken Keyes or Ted Key, I'm not really sure which person was responsible for that table, but kind of make up a new table. And I would accept that as a task to do myself, but I don't think I'm going to get around to it very quickly, although I might. But it would be a nice one for anybody else to do as a learning experience, and also to produce a usable item that could be laminated and given out to people. I'm going to go back to the structural differential now and say that either a 3-dimensional or a 2-dimensional version of the structural differential, either a 2 or 3-dimensional physical object that you could rearrange and play with, or even a 2-dimensional diagram, which is certainly easier to make, or if we have any programmers among us, a structural differential program as an app or a web page or an app on various platforms. To me, app usually implies a phone or a tablet, but I think a current human, I'm going to kind of setting myself outside of that characteristic, probably thinks of an app as interchangeable with a program, and I accept that that's valid. But anyway, a structural differential as a program, or maybe a macro in a spreadsheet, could be really interesting and might be more usable than the physical structural differential, although I think the physical structural differential, or SD as people in General Semantics would call it, does have some value, just as I still think learning to write is valuable, but I'm not sure how long it will be. I guess we and our descendants will find out. I think that's it for me. If you've gotten through all of this, thank you for watching or listening, depending on what you were doing. I hope that the attempt to make watching somewhat more bearable or less annoying, showing a title card for an hour, was successful. By all means, subscribe and indicate if you're okay with notifications. I don't know whether I'll do live streams versus just uploading video on an ongoing basis, but I believe if you turn notifications on, you get a notification when I'm starting a live stream. And what else can I say? There were things that occurred to me when I was reading Taming Your Mind, but I think since I made the request about joining, and I always kind of want to keep that for the very, very, very end, I'll just sign off now at 11:07 p.m. on March 28th, 2023. This is Len Fisher or Tuna Jeans, and this document, to the extent it has any copyrightability at all, is copyright 2023 myself, but it is licensed to the extent I have the right to do that for any of the stuff inside it under a Creative Commons attribution license. And with that bit of legalese, I'll say good night.